Good morning, everyone. As we all know, the focus of this COP is finance. Today on Energy Day, we bring to you this session, which looks at the realities and challenges in 3 important oil and gas producing countries, whose national and local economies rely on this industry to stay afloat and to provide essential public services. These countries are Colombia, Mexico, and Nigeria. Our speakers here today will share insights on the specific needs, on the specific energy transition finance needs of these countries, and we will also be hearing the latest on the finance negotiations that are relevant for the needs of these countries. These 3 countries have something in common. They all rely on national oil companies, which are also known the hidden side of the oil and gas industry, producing over half of the world's oil and gas. These companies have remained very much at the margins of COP discussions and climate negotiation, which is something that we are trying to change, hence this panel. I'm delighted to introduce our excellent panel of speakers. First, we will hear from Fernanda Ballesteros, who leads the Natural Resource Governance Institute's work in Mexico. We will also hear from Enebi Opalugwa from Budget Foundation in Nigeria, then from Vance Culvert, Senior Policy Advisor at IISD, and lastly from Bronwyn Tucker, who is a Global Public Finance Co-Manager at Oil Change International. So without further ado, Fernanda.
Thank you, Gabi. Well, Mexico has a new government, and there is a lot of expectations from the climate community in Mexico, but also international community, as how will the new president, Claudia Sheinbaum, a climate scientist, how will she push forward Mexico's climate agenda and particularly energy transition? President Claudia Sheinbaum is not here at COP29, but we know that she believes in the urgency to promote the energy transition in Mexico and advance decarbonization and push for a just and equitable energy transition. But now she has to act. And even if it's too soon to make a full assessment, we do see that in her first month in office, President Sheinbaum has focused on pushing former President López Obrador pending reforms, which has been a little bit of a disappointment for many, that she has not broken with the past and made a stronger statement towards her own vision of the energy policies. The previous president, López Obrador, went backwards on renewables uptake, and he also supported an increase in Mexico's national oil company, Pemex. He increased production and refinery capacity with no considerations of the cost or the debt or the environmental impacts. And he left many incomplete projects in his trail. And that is why we believe that President Sheinbaum has to step aside from this legacy and do it as quickly as possible. So a second call for President Sheinbaum would be to be open to civil society and other social sector stakeholders. Civil society organizations in Mexico, particularly climate organizations, are eager to help her and have been working for a long time on proposals to move forward a just transition that addresses Mexico's national challenges. NRGI, for example, is part of México Resiliente coalition, with more than 30 organizations that have developed the National Plan for Decarbonization and Climate Resilience with specific recommendations. One recommendation in particular that NRGI has insisted is for her to have a credible and actionable strategy towards energy transition. She has to put Pemex, our national oil company, in the center of her plan of transition. Pemex extracts 95% of oil and gas of oil and gas in Mexico, and it owns most of the gas and oil infrastructure. So when we talk about oil and gas in Mexico, we're really talking about Pemex. And we have to remember that Mexico emits more than 25% of Latin America and the Caribbean's emissions, and 64% of the country's greenhouse emissions are tied to the oil and gas sector from transport or electricity. So there is really no way around. Climate action and the energy transition in Mexico must include this NOC, Pemex. And putting Pemex in the center of this transition, we say that it requires four aspects. First, that the Mexican government reassesses Pemex futures production and business plan, reduces Pemex operational greenhouse emissions, particularly methane. Also, to consider and be coherent with global commitments, including the NDCs and the methane initiatives. And finally, that it focuses on a just and an equitable approach that puts first most vulnerable communities, particularly in oil-rich regions in Mexico, Tabasco, Campeche, Veracruz. And lastly, we call on President Sheinbaum to also take up a place of leadership in climate action and bring Mexico back into a place of leadership, so this COP29 can succeed on firming up a climate finance deal.
Thank you very much. Enevi, please.
All right, thank you very much. For Nigeria, Nigeria is quite a bit in a dicey situation. So the country has recognized energy transition, has made commitments. A couple of our NDCs speak to Nigeria's transition plans, but mostly conditional. Let's say the critical commitments are based on conditional support in financing and technical support from the global community. Some of these include reducing gas flaring, which is a big problem in Nigeria. The target is 2030. Reduce emissions by 45% conditionally and 20% unconditionally. There are some policies that have been put in place to achieve that. The country intends to convert its gas flare volumes into usable gas for industry and power generation. So when you look at all of these commitments, these NDCs, and now put it side by side current initiatives to expand gas production and oil production, it really looks a bit dicey because you seem to be speaking from one side of your mouth and speaking a different thing from the other side of the mouth. And it's not unexpected. If you look at Nigeria's revenue stream, majority of that comes from oil production. Oil resources, oil sales account for over 90% of our foreign exchange earnings, over 60% of revenue, national revenue. And so it's quite expected that the country will easily fall back to its oil resources. That's at federal level. At subnational levels, all the states depend on oil proceeds. Right? Only 3 states can support their operating expenses using their own internally generated revenue. The rest depend on federal transfers for almost everything. Oil-producing communities, states, depend more on oil proceeds. If you look at the federal transfers from the central government to oil-producing states, it's about 65% is from what we call 13% derivation formula, which is proceeds from oil revenue from their regions. And so you see a lot of dependency on oil revenue and oil sales, which puts the country at great risk, all right? When the transition kicks in fully, if there isn't a broader revenue base, then the country will be fiscally unstable. And that is why we are calling on the government to intensify efforts to broaden revenue base, diversify economies. Non-oil revenue has increased slightly in the last decade, depending on the year you look. When the share of oil revenue is, or when the oil industry is doing poorly, the share of non-oil revenue increases. But for all intents and purposes, the non-oil revenue seems to be performing a bit better than it was 5-10 years ago. So there are efforts to improve non-oil revenue, but that is not yet strong enough to sustain the country's economy without oil proceeds. One, the risks are high, and so Nigeria needs to prepare adequately to ensure that its economy is fiscally protected. However, there are certain situations that need to be considered. Without broader financing and broader considerations for countries like Nigeria in the climate architecture, it will be difficult for such countries to just jump off the fossil fuel train or the oil producing train just like that because of economic considerations, because of the stringent and risky situations that the country finds itself in. So for Nigeria, we call on greater efforts to broaden economic revenues, broaden the revenue base, prepare for the transition, especially at subnational level, because when this kicks in, they are left unprotected. It could imply serious economic and social instability for those states and for the country. Thank you.
Very much, Nevi. Vance, please, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. I will be talking about some work that was done by a couple of our Colombian colleagues, Paula Young-Pajaras and Eduardo Posadera. Colombia has been seen as a country on the leading edge of the global transition. When the Petro government came in 2022, they joined the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance and the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. And through their national oil company, Ecopetrol, they moved to reduce the new licensing after existing licensing that had been scheduled was already allocated. And so therefore it has been seen as a national oil company on the leading front of the transition. When I was talking to a senior oil economist in Brazil last year who advises their national oil company, I first started hearing the narrative that this had been not a success and Brazil shouldn't follow the Colombian model because of the impacts on their credit rating, both for Ecopetrol's credit rating and for the national credit rating. I also heard this narrative when we were at the World Bank annuals earlier this year. So we spent some time looking into this narrative to see what the foundation is. It's certainly true that Ecopetrol is important in the Colombian economy. It's not just makes up 6% of GDP and 13% of government revenues, but it's also responsible for 55% of export revenues. However, when you start looking into what actually happened with the credit ratings, there's been 3 major credit rating agencies who've had about 2 rounds each of credit rating shifts over the past 18 months, and only 2 of them have had shifts in their ratings. One changed from a neutral to a negative outlook without actually shifting the rating. And there's a list of reasons for this. The reasons include large national debt loads, decisions to focus on shareholder payouts, the decision of Ecopetrol to... Sorry, can people hear me better now? The decision to purchase a major electricity transmission company, and increases in government spending. There's an assumption by many of the credit rating agencies that Ecopetrol is central enough to the government's economic outlook that they will finance any debt that the organization takes on. Why is this important? It's important because this narrative, which has been being developed and is being used by other national oil companies, is not borne out by the logic of why credit rating agencies have been changing their outlooks for Colombia. And secondly, Colombia continues to be at the forefront of a transition in the oil and gas sector, particularly with the new country platform, which has been discussed. They have a plan for $40 billion of investment transitioning in a variety of sectors, of which $10 billion is being requested from international financing. There's a list of important and interesting projects ranging from renewables to just transition projects. And the success of this project could and should send positive signals to other countries with national oil companies, contrary to some of the discourse we're currently hearing.
Thank you, Vance. Bronwyn, over to you. If I could ask you to hold the mic very close to your mouth, please, because some people are having trouble hearing. Thank you.
Yeah, sounds good. Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to kind of connect the dots between these different local contexts and what is in the COP29 negotiations this year, and that, of course, is the new climate finance goal. And so I'll kind of go through the current state of funding for fossil fuel phase out and energy transition, what we need, and then a bit of the state of play. And I think just overall, I think the kind of costs of a just transition and paying for fossil fuel phase out and doing that in a way that's planned and is not going to devastate economies is a really big gap in the literature and some of the discourse, but there's been some exciting breakthroughs, so that's some good news. I guess kind of overall, you can look at there has been an increase in the last 4 years in, if we look at energy transition finance overall, so looking at clean energy, looking at renewables, energy efficiency, electric vehicles, and funding for fair fossil fuel phase out. It has increased, but that increase has been limited almost entirely to the OECD and China. If you look at the combination of the rest of the world, that's really flatlined. And we know the kind of looking at everything that would be needed, it is closer to 7 trillion. So we're looking at a huge gap in the costs of what we need to have a fair transition. That 7 trillion estimate adds the best available estimate of fair fossil fuel phase out. So that's things like including social protection measures and reskilling for impacted workers and communities, economic diversification, site cleanup, and ensuring that there is social participation in planning and that workers and communities are included. Those costs are not included in many of the global estimates, and when they are, they're really understated. And so that in itself is a huge issue. The kind of best available estimate is from the Civil Society Equity Review that was released last year, and that estimates that the fair share of rich countries' contribution to these costs in the global south would be $243 billion a year, which in itself is larger than the numbers that the rich countries are talking about for the NCQG overall, which is definitely a concern. And I think the other major concern, other than how much the kind of fair fossil fuel phase-out costs are ignored, is also just really the assumption that for mitigation overall, and especially the energy transition, that the private sector on its own can bear these costs, or also even public finance in a commercial scale, so things like national development banks or NOCs, and that there's not kind of grant funding needed for needed for these costs. And so we have a new analysis from OCI out today kind of showing that the main solution that's often posed for filling these costs, basically using a little bit of public money to try to attract private sector money, so blended finance, is really underperforming compared to major models and major claims, even in lower middle income countries. And so we do really need a different approach to funding the energy transition, and that needs to be looking at industrial policy and funding at the same time, and giving more options than just commercial loans or slightly subsidized finance as well. And so our analysis kind of compared to major models are saying, for every $1 of subsidized finance, you can attract $5 to $7. What we found is in the last 5 years, every dollar of concessional public finance has leveraged only 93 cents in lower middle income countries. And so this is really relevant to the climate finance negotiations right now, because across the board, of course, developed countries are not wanting to pay, but often mitigation and energy transition is kind of said that dedicated climate finance isn't needed for it, and or it isn't needed on it. Sorry, that grants and highly concessional finance is much less needed for energy transition, and I think that's an approach that really needs to be reevaluated. And maybe just to close off, I think it is really clear that we need public grants at scale for the energy transition. We know that rich countries can pay these costs. And I think the other piece of the puzzle is also really looking at, we know that a lot of the biggest polluters are in the global north, and I think they are talking and talk a lot about international climate leadership when we come to the UNFCCC. I think it's really overdue that we see these countries also show leadership at home and phase out fastest, and to write this into their NDCs. And I think that will also go a really long way into unlocking the international climate leadership that they claim to want. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Bronwyn, for that very, very timely intervention. I'd like to now open it to any questions that people may have. Well, while people think about what they may want to ask, I wonder if I can come back to you, Bronwyn, and maybe offer a couple of top tips for our friends from the media of things that they ought to be looking for over the next few days, things that you expect to be breaking and worth looking to with respect to the realities in these countries and the issues that we've just discussed.
Yeah, definitely. And so, yeah, because I did mention there's some good news and I did not include it. So basically, I think right now we have a text that is for the new climate finance goal that is much longer than the previous one. And the good thing there is that that means there's, for the first time, the options on the table that we actually need for finance at scale in the NCQG, and on fossil fuel phase out specifically. There is a lot of good language on providing dedicated support specifically for a fossil fuel phase out. That's the first time that's appeared in draft texts. And there's also good language explicitly excluding fossil fuel support from climate finance and making sure this money is used properly and not for further expansion. And then lastly, there's also good language on just transition and making sure finance is aligned with just transition plans and can support things like worker and community-led planning. And so that's the really good news. Obviously, there's a huge fight ahead still, but I think it's a really important precedent to point to and to really fight for these options to stay in the text.
Thank you so very much. Do we have any additional comments from our panelists about issues that we feel our friends from the media ought to be keeping an eye on? Vance, go ahead. You look like you want to say something. Oh, do we have a question? Please go ahead. If you could say your name and publication, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Gideon Ajimandu. I'm from Ghana. And then my name is Gideon from Ghana, from the National Oil Company of Ghana. And we are proud to say that we are collaborating with NRGI in Ghana, and they've been very helpful to us. So my question is that the gentleman from Nigeria said that they intend to reduce methane emissions by about 45% conditionally, and then unconditionally 25%. Is that correct?
20% unconditionally.
Okay, 20%. Okay. I want to believe that most of this comes from the oil and gas sector. And so if that's the case, have you seen any kind of activity on the part of the operators in your oil and gas fields in terms of their personal sustainability targets, environmental targets? Have you seen any change in their plans?
Okay, so conditional commitments, 45% conditional, most of that is from the oil and gas sector. Unconditional commitments, 20% by 2030, is not, most of that does not include oil and gas and power sector emission cuts, right? The, let's say, juicy emission cuts have been left to conditional support, right? But that has not left, that doesn't mean that nothing has happened. I think in the last 2 years, the government released the, methane emission reductions guidelines, and has mandated companies to start reporting on methane emission plans. From next year, we should start seeing the reports of those emission plans as they unfold on a company-by-company basis. There is also the short-lived climate pollutants that also goes outside the oil and gas sector to monitor fugitive emissions, both from oil and gas sector and other industrial processes as well. And then there are some other, like I mentioned earlier, the gas commercialization program, which is more of a gas expansion program anyway, but the idea is to stop gas flaring by 2030. So those are some of the efforts that have been put in place. We keep monitoring the situation and looking forward to these reports so that we can begin to interrogate the process and see what companies are beginning to do to reduce emissions across board in the oil and gas sector.
Thank you very much, Nevi. Thank you very much for that question. And I want to close by asking Fernando one last question about a very recent development in Mexico, and it's that the new president released her new hydrocarbon strategy just a few days ago. Is there anything about that that you'd like to highlight, Fernanda?
Yes, she presented in her morning conference the new strategy or plan for hydrocarbons. And I think, it has to be fully disclosed, and more information needs to come from that. But from what we know, there's still like some non-cohesive messages. No, it, for example, continues talking about expanding refining capacity. And this has been a huge deal in Mexico. So just to put a little bit in context, Pemex is the most indebted oil company in the world. So the debt is more than $100 billion, or 5% of Mexico's GDP. And it's really a bomb for public finances. No? So keep on investing in refining, even in a context of energy transition, doesn't make a lot of sense. So those kind of things, I believe, need to be considered.
Thank you very much, Fernanda, and thank you very much to all of you for joining us, and keep an eye on national oil companies. Thank you.